So again, civil liberties are Constitution's protections from government power. Civil liberties include things like right to free speech, right to privacy, etc. So all of those rights that you think of, those count as civil liberties, because the freedom of speech is a protection from an overstep of government power. Civil rights, on the other hand, is protections by government power, or and the obligation to take positive action on behalf of its citizens. So an example of a civil right is when you apply to a college or for a job, you should be picked based off of your merit and not your skin color. That is a civil right. So civil liberties are protection from an overstep of government power, so a government being dangerous. Civil rights are the government protecting you from anything that could be negatively affecting you. Give us 15 more seconds to finish having these examples written down. This leads us to the Bill of Rights. You don't need to write all this down. This is on your piece of paper. So as we know, the Bill of Rights was ratified and added to the Constitution in 1791. So again, the Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791. Remind me in the chat, who supported a Bill of Rights? What was that group of people called? Awesome, thank you, Nyasia, Isis, yes, Anti-Federalists. Awesome job, Kamisha. Great job, Ariana. Great job, Malachi. Thank you, Aaron. Okay, so something to remember that about the Bill of Rights that is super important is that this was written in the 1790s. And so they are very particular to the issues facing the colonists, and which were the new Americans. So for example, Amendment 3, the government may not force US citizens to shelter soldiers in their homes. I'm pretty sure we don't think about this amendment very often. We're not really stressed about the government forcing soldiers into our homes. However, American colonists did have to deal with this a lot before the American Revolution. So this is an example of these amendments being written in their time. And this same type of thinking is applied to like the Second Amendment, where it says US citizens have the right to keep and bear arms or own guns. That is a Second Amendment right. However, many people will argue the guns that were being protected at this time period are very different than the type of firearms that we have now, just because of changing technology. Which brings us to looking at some of the most essential amendments that we have to know. So again, this is what I'm saying. You don't need to write, the Congress shall make no law respecting. You don't need to write the exact quotes. So the First Amendment, clause number 1. So the First Amendment, clause 1, is the Religion Establishment Clause. And the Religious Establishment Clause declares that the American government cannot create an official religion. So there cannot be any Church of the United States in the same way that there was a Church of England. So they cannot have a government-sponsored religion. It is. Okay, so that is the Religion Establishment Clause. Now, for the next piece of the freedom of religion in Amendment number 1, the First Amendment, the Religion Free Exercise Clause. And what this argues is that the government cannot prohibit any religion. So, for example, in England at this time, if you are not a part of the Church of England, better be careful of your head. Like 100 years earlier. This is when the Church of England is in charge, they're chopping people's heads off. When the Catholic Church is in charge, they're chopping Protestant heads off. And so the United States is like, we probably shouldn't let that happen. So again, First Amendment, Religion Free Exercise Clause, citizens have the right to practice whatever the religion they prefer. Aaron, I would think so. The next piece of the First Amendment is the freedom of speech and freedom of the press. So obviously we know that freedom of speech and freedom of press are really important to the American experience, but there are issues in freedom of speech. Does symbolic speech count? So for example, we are going to talk about one of my favorite, I'm gonna go back for 1 second. So again, freedom of, other direction. So again, free exercise clause, Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of a religion. Give us 20 more seconds to make sure we're all there. So obviously the First Amendment, freedom of speech and freedom of the press is super important to American life, but there are issues. So like does symbolic speech count? An example of symbolic speech could be in Tinker versus Des Moines, which we are going to go over next week, where a group of students were protesting the Vietnam War by wearing a black armband around their arm to school. They weren't saying anything, but they were suspended for doing so. And they argued that it was a part of their freedom of speech, even though they weren't saying anything. Freedom of speech, should we, there are enhanced sentences for hate speech. So if it is a hate crime instead of a general murder, if it's a murder based off of somebody's gender, race, sexual orientation, etc., it is considered a hate crime. And so there's usually added time to that. Where are people able to have free speech and where are they not? Does obscenity count? Do we limit that? And there are some unprotected pieces of speech. So like written versus spoken speech. We'll give us 1 minute to finish writing down those different issues. 15 more seconds to finish writing down. Okay. The next piece of the First Amendment is the freedom of assembly and petition. Freedom of assembly in this term is like freedom to protest. So you're able to assemble with others. This is connected with freedom of speech, but it can be regulated by time, place, or manner. What manner refers to is it a violent protest or a peaceful protest? Sorry, guys, it's a lot of amendments today. And we're still on the first one. We're not going through all 10. We're just going through some of the most important ones. Okay, 10 more seconds. So again, there can be regulations put on assembly or protest based off of where, when, and how people are doing it. Jumping to Fourth Amendment. This is when all of my crime show junkies are going to start recognizing things. So Fourth Amendment is where we start to go through the rights of criminal defendants. So Fourth Amendment is the requirement of a warrant if somebody goes into your house for evidence, if you are being sued for something. So again, the Fourth Amendment is if you have charges pressed against you, they cannot, they have to have a warrant in order to find evidence. And in addition to this, there's the exclusionary rule. And the exclusionary rule means that if something is received without evidence, then it cannot be used as evidence against you in a court of law. So you have to have a warrant if you are going to try to get that evidence. Which brings us to the Fifth Amendment, which is a continuation of the rights of criminal defendants. And the Fifth Amendment, again, if you're a crime show junkie, you'll hear I plead the Fifth a lot. What the Fifth Amendment argues is that no person shall be a witness against themselves, which means you cannot self-incriminate. So again, so the Fifth Amendment means, so like if you hear somebody say, I plead the Fifth, they can't do that in testimony against another person, but they can if it's going to incriminate themselves. And this applies to any testimony in a trial. And again, for my crime show junkies, Miranda versus Arizona, your Miranda rights. In Miranda versus Arizona in 1966, Miranda argued that he did not know that he had the right to remain silent, the right to a lawyer, etc. And so he was, and so that makes it to the Supreme Court. And because of this, that is now why if you are arrested, a police officer must read you your Miranda rights. And if they don't, you get to leave. And we've talked about like things like precedents before and things like that. What a remedy is not a revision, but an addition to an amendment. So so the Fifth Amendment, in addition to that, is Miranda versus Arizona, which adds the necessity that a criminal defendant must be read their Miranda rights. Yes, Nyasha.
Is this also associated with like the fact that like if you're on trial, they don't want you to like incriminate like your spouse? Like you can't like incriminate, like, you know what I mean, right? You're not supposed to like say anything that could get your spouse in trouble or something.
Yes. Yeah, that's another example. Sixth Amendment is a continuation of our rights for criminal defendants. And in the Sixth Amendment, it says the right to counsel and a right to a jury trial with a jury of your peers. I will elaborate more on jury of your peers in just a moment. Sorry. Why is it? It should be fine now. I'm sorry. Okay. So in the right to counsel means right to a lawyer. In jury trials or a jury of your peers, I'm going to give you guys an example. So let's say in the 1960s, let me come up with a different example. So for example, if I were arrested and tried for something and there were no women on that jury, is that a jury of my peers? If there are no women or no young adults? Exactly. So a jury trial or right to a jury of your peers, that is, it's not to say that that jury would need to be all women, but I need to have a peer or somebody that might understand. So for example, if a woman is a victim of a sexual assault, she deserves a jury of her peers to like have her testimony empathized with or understood. So that is why we have a jury for a trial, right to a jury from a trial of your peer, trial to a jury of your peers. That's what it is. Whew, what a day. So that is super important. There was something else. Next up, the Eighth Amendment, again, continuation of rights of criminal defendants. So the Eighth Amendment means no excessive bail. So if you are somebody that is under the poverty line, then your bail cannot be over a certain amount of money because there's just no way you can pay it. Because obviously if you have a lot of money, you have more accessibility to paying off a bail fine. Also, no cruel or unusual punishments. And some may argue that the death penalty counts as a cruel or unusual punishment. And an example of a cruel or unusual punishment within the last couple of decades, I can't remember when, juveniles can no longer be sent to life in prison without parole. So like that's an example of what was considered a cruel or unusual punishment that has been reversed. Give us 30 seconds. We'll move to the next one. Okay, 2 more. Next is the 9th Amendment, which is the right to privacy. Which basically means the enlistment of the enumeration, so the specific listing of certain rights should not be used to deny rights for other people. And what's important to know about the right to privacy is this is the amendment that was utilized in Roe versus Wade, which provides, which removes government interference with a woman's access to birth control. Safe and legal birth control. And that is because the Supreme Court argued that a woman's right to privacy includes that type of health care. Okay, I'll give us 10 more seconds, and then we'll go to the last amendment, which should look familiar. Yes, so the 9th Amendment, right to privacy, as a reminder, that was utilized in Roe versus Wade because they believe that even though birth control is maybe not listed directly in the Bill of Rights, they argued that that falls under the umbrella of right to privacy. And finally, the last amendment, the 10th Amendment, which we should remember, which is powers not given to the federal government are reserved to the states. So again, all powers with the federal government are reserved to the states. Give us 30 seconds to finish writing that down. I'm gonna go and stop sharing. So one of the biggest issues with the Bill of Rights and this idea of individual liberties is we also have this question. What's more important, individual liberties or public safety? Take 30 seconds to think to yourself, what is more important, individual liberties or public safety? And share out your initial responses in the Zoom chat. Because we're short on time, we're not going to read the document. Okay, I'm starting to see some different ideas. This is something where, again, there is no right answer, but it's like if you have to choose. Cool. Well, it looks like we're mostly on public safety. However, individual liberties was the bigger side in the other class. So just shows that we all have different ideas. What is an example where, there you go, Emmanuel. Emmanuel's really said that it took till Janiyah for somebody to agree with public safety. I mean, to agree with individual liberties. So an example of public safety versus individual liberties could be the coronavirus. Is public safety during an epidemic more important than an individual's right to go places? Or is it more important for a person to be able to practice their right to protest versus the potential of public safety? So it goes both ways. What do you think, Isis and then Ariana?
In like the pandemic situation, or
In either.
well, according to this like corona, I would say that public safety would be more of an issue because I mean it can lead to death, and I feel like that's more important, a lot of people dying, than you wanting to go out and protest about something.
I agree. Oh, give me one moment. I agree because I feel like the individual rights. Okay, you want to go out places, but like I feel like because how detrimental it is to go out and how dangerous it is, I feel like public safety is more important than.
Okay. Erica, go ahead.
I see what they're saying and I agree with that. I just would like to point out that the fact that people are protesting and risking all that during a time like this just highlights how severe the situation and how determined they are to change it. But protesting doesn't really seem to be doing much or changing much. So there's also that side.
Naisha, go ahead.
I agree with like Ariana and Isis. I don't think that the protests aren't doing much, but that's like on a side note. The liberties in this case, which is like mostly a peace bill of rights, I don't really think that these liberties that we're protecting is really doing much for majority of the population, because a lot of these aren't being followed, like the excessive like bail and like punishment. Like the marijuana charges could get like 20 plus years for like African American man, but then like a white man might get like a fine of like $200 or something like that. So I don't think that these liberties are worth protecting, or at least they aren't worth like being treated in the way that they are right now. So I feel like as of right now, public safety is more important than these liberties, because that's what the government is showing us by not protecting these liberties for everybody.
Mm-hmm. No, Naisha brings up a really interesting point that it's like individual liberties are great if they're being protected for all people, which is a whole other thing. And I brought up the coronavirus just because we've seen the narrative that wearing a mask, not being able to go out in public, all of these things, a certain group of the population is using that rhetoric as a reason for why they shouldn't be following public safety. So like I've heard people say, I have the right to assemble when it comes to like hanging out outside, but it's like, that's not what a right to assemble is. So that's just an example of how people are utilizing the Bill of Rights to construct and fit their own narrative. And there's ISIS, I'm sorry. Sorry, I just see ISIS laughing in the corner. So yeah, so like individual liberties are great, but people are going to manipulate their individual liberties to fit their own narrative and to fit their own needs. Tomorrow, we're going to be doing a deeper dive into a Supreme Court case that you guys might remember if you've already done the homework, which is talking about freedom of speech during a war. Like what kind of limits should we have for that? And so we're going to do a deep dive on that tomorrow. And then Thursday for your asynchronous day, you're going to do a continued deep dive on these rights for individuals. And we'll talk more about those on Monday. So be prepared to come into class with your homework completed tomorrow, due at the start of class. Otherwise, you'll get a 0 in the Zoom engagement grade. So please get it done. And it will be 50% of the classwork grade for tomorrow. So homework is 50% of the classwork grade, and you need it to not get a 0 in the Zoom participation grade. So I think that is it. The last thing is homework Friday at 8 o'clock for the key terms, but that's a couple days away. If you guys have any questions, feel free to chat me. Make sure that your parents have scheduled a report card conference. I'm pretty sure everybody on here that's in my advisory, you guys are good to go. Okay, that's it for announcements. You guys can do your exit ticket. Exit ticket is worth 2 points. Make sure you have a thesis and evidence. Your evidence can come from anything we talked about in discourse or any of the specific amendments. So your evidence can be an amendment. Also, make sure you submit photos of your lecture notes for 50% of your grade. Thank you, Janaya, Aaron, and Montana, and Erica. All four of you guys are free to go. Please make sure that you upload photos of your notes. Ariana, Ziara, you guys are free to go. Well done. Isis, you're free to go. Thank you, Nyasha. Thank you, Tisa. You're free to go. Okay, guys, take 1 more minute to finish up and then submit whatever you have. I want to make sure you get some credit.
Do we have to turn in our notes?
Yes, Tisa, you have to turn in your notes.
Okay.
Okay, guys, 1 more minute and then submit whatever you have. I would wait longer, except I have a meeting. Thank you, Kezia. You may go.
Yes, the massacre of 1792.
Okay, everybody, please go ahead and submit whatever you have. I'm sure it's great. Thank you, Adarius. You're free to go. Thank you, Kamisha. You're free to go. See you guys tomorrow.
That's what's called the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror.
Malachi, go ahead and submit your stuff for me, bud. Hi, Kamisha. Bye, Adarius.
Your eyes are pretty. That's all I want to say. Okay, bye.
Okay, Malachi, go ahead and get that submitted. I gotta go, but please submit that so I can give you credit, okay? And submit photos of your lesson as well. Cool. Bye, Malachi.